I think, as we can all hear, the book is written absolutely beautifully. I know Jamila and I were both talking about the book as we were reading through it, and we were saying that it absolutely just reads and sounds like poetry throughout the whole book. Have you always written this way? Is this kind of your style?
Yeah. I definitely got my start writing really bad poetry on Tumblr. I don't know if you Tumblr. It will never see the light of day, it's really bad. And I fancied myself a poet until I did the master's in creative writing at UBC and became friends with real poets, and I was like, oh no, I'm not a poet. But yeah, the lines, I think in images and metaphors, and those come to me first. More so, the story is a struggle, plot is a struggle, but I like the language is where the fun is for me, for sure. Yeah.
I love that, thank you. So this is your first novel. Where did you come up with the idea and inspiration for this book?
Sure, so the story, as you heard when Madison kind of summed it up at the beginning, it's told through 4 generations of one family. Each section is narrated by kind of a subsequent member of that family. And so the story kind of began for me with Calypso, whose story kind of takes place in the middle of the book. And she is 17, and she's grown up on the grounds of this hotel that her uncle owns. Her parents are like the caretakers of the property. And she's very forthright. I don't know if anyone will know what that means, but she's precocious. And she kind of thinks of herself as a seductress, but in many ways, she's a victim, but she would never characterize herself that way. And so I became fascinated by the idea, by the character of Calypso. It's inspired by Greek mythology. She's a character who appears in the Odyssey. And I don't really remember how exactly I stumbled across the story of Calypso in the Odyssey, but it just caught my attention in the way that things do, kind of just serendipitously. And I was intrigued by the idea of Calypso, and I think I was curious about whether etymologically there was some sort of connection between Calypso in the Greek mythology and Calypso music. There isn't, but that was what triggered the interest. And then so I went out and I bought a copy of the Odyssey, and Calypso appears for something only like 7 pages of the book. It's very, very small, but she looms so large in kind of like the kind of collective imagination that we have about this myth. And so I was really intrigued by the absence of information about Calypso. I wanted to know more about her. I wanted to know if she could tell this story, what would she say? She's framed in the myth as this seductress who kind of traps this hero on an island and prevents him from carrying on his journey home to his wife. And I just thought that just wasn't enough for me. I wanted to know more about her. I wanted her to be able to speak. And so I originally wrote a short story. I imagined her. It wasn't a big leap to kind of imagine her as a young woman in Barbados, in a place where, in the Caribbean, women are often hypersexualized and almost packaged as part of the tourism product in a way. Come to paradise, we've got beautiful women, so there were parallels there that really intrigued me. And so I wrote a story that was essentially a 10-page version of what ends up being her section in the novel. And I workshopped it in a fiction class at UBC. And basically everyone said unanimously, there's more here, And then I got intrigued by the intergenerational side of things. I wanted to write a story that explored the unknowability of our parents and the unknowability of our own past, and kind of how we can only ever see our ancestors as related to us, and can't really imagine them as whole people beyond how we see them. So I wanted to explore that. So then I went down a rabbit hole, figuring out the Greek, the connections to Greek mythology, and Calypso's father was Atlas, and so that opened up a world of possibilities for his section of the book. And then her son, there isn't really a direct reference to Greek mythology for Nautilus's character. I kind of had to invent him, but I was just intrigued by the idea of what if Calypso had a child with this foreign man, this older foreign man, and what would his life be like? And so yeah, that's kind of how it all began. Yeah.
Love that. Thank you for
Chair.
sharing. And you're definitely getting into some of the other questions that I was thinking about as well. And in the book, there's a quote that says, "Names, they're important, don't you think?" So I was going to ask how you came to those names, and I guess it's inspiration from Greek mythology. But did you come up with Nautilus, or is that Greek mythology as well?
That one I kind of came up with by myself. There's a few very vague references to Calypso maybe having a child with some sort of seafaring etymology, nauseous or something like that. And so there's actually one of those other strange serendipitous things. There's a hotel in Barbados that's on Bay Street. That's a family-owned hotel, very small, and it's called Nautilus. And so it just felt right. But yeah, the names, people often wanted, over the course of the editing of the novel and getting it published, there were a few people who asked if I would change them, but I just didn't want to. I just felt very attached to these names, and people in the Caribbean often have really weird names, so it didn't feel that much of a stretch to have an Atlas and a Calypso and a Nautilus. They were important to me.
Love that. Have you always been really interested in Greek mythology? Is there a reason that inspired the book?
No, I get that question a lot, and I often also get asked if I'm going to write another book inspired by Greek mythology, and it was Calypso. Calypso was what drew me in, and there my interest kind of began and ended. I only read the Odyssey all the way through because I knew that I would show up to a panel at some point and some middle-aged white guy would be like, well, actually, in the Greek mythology, I was like, oh, okay, I need to be prepared. But no, I mean, I would maybe turn to it again in the future if I'm seeking inspiration. I think it's really interesting to be kind of like a writer of color and be in conversation with these kinds of canonical texts. I think that is something that's important. And so I'm interested in that idea, but I had no kind of original interest in Greek mythology. It was just Calypso kind of pulled me in. And then using the Greek mythology to kind of fall back on as like scaffolding for the story. Anytime I started to get a little lost in the weeds and I wasn't sure where the plot was going or what kind of decision a character would make, I could think back to the mythology as a roadmap.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was also pulled to the dedications that you had right at the beginning and kind of wondering why you chose the dedications. And one is from the Odyssey, reading, "For there is nothing dearer to a man than his own country and his parents. And however splendid a home he may have in a foreign country, if it be far from father and mother, he does not care about it."
Do you mind speaking a little bit to why you chose
Sure.
that? No one's ever asked me about the dedications before. Well, I wanted to have a quote from the Odyssey just because the book is it was so foundational that I wanted to reference it. And when I came across that quote, I was like, oh, this is what my whole book is about. Like, it's about the idea of home and what it means and the ties between kind of feeling trapped in a place, but also feeling like you can't really fit in or be yourself anywhere else. And it's so much about family and inherited trauma and the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so it just kind of fit very aptly. But it was mostly just I wanted a reference to the Odyssey and the dedication just to kind of make that connection really obvious. And then the other one, I don't know if you have it there.
Yeah, the other one here is a quote by Jamaica
Kincaid.
Jamaica Kincaid from A Small Place, that the native does not like the tourist is not hard to explain. For every native of every place is a potential tourist, and every tourist is a native of somewhere.
Yeah, so the book is very critical of tourism, and it explores the idea of tourism as basically a colonial legacy. And if anyone's never read A Small Place by Jamaica Kincaid, I highly recommend it. It's a text that speaks about the tourist as almost a grotesque person and idea. And it was a part of the book that was slightly less commercial, slightly less appealing to my white publishers, something that I had to defend and explain a lot in my publishing process. And so it just meant a lot to me. And so I wanted to have it in the dedication so that if you pick up the book, you know going into it that this is a central theme. It isn't just this kind of dramatic story about a family, intergenerational, trauma and this kind of love affair, and all, which it is all of that as well. But it is, I'm speaking quite critically about something that I care a lot about, and so I wanted that to be right up on the front. But yeah, I highly recommend A Small Place by Jenny Kincaid. It's a good essay.
Awesome, good to know. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense for the themes throughout the book, and I really liked the quote as well, and definitely noticed the theme of tourism throughout the book. There's another quote, if you don't, I'm sorry I'm just quoting a lot here, I promise this isn't all going to be quotes today.
Maybe you won't even have to buy it.
But there's a few quotes I really like about tourism, and one is, tourists looking at me from the corner of their eyes as if I'm a black cloud coming to ruin their vacation. They don't want to see me, don't want to know that I exist. And that one really hit home as well, and a lot of themes about tourism throughout, and themes of tourism and ownership of land and belonging to a place but not belonging to a place. Do you want to speak on that a little bit more, or why that theme and messaging was so important to you in the book?
Yeah, well, so I grew up in Barbados. I lived there until I was 18, and I worked when I was a teenager as a server in this restaurant that was very close to the port. And so you get a lot of cruise ship tourists who are the worst because they get everything for free on the cruise, so they don't want to spend any money. And they're just so obnoxious. And so I mean, I've been a tourist, and it's an inescapable thing to be if you want, we want to see the world. So I don't have I'm not on any sort of agenda against like banning travel or something like that. But what I wanted to explore in the book was this idea of having your personhood be almost kind of a part of this tourism product, right? Because especially somewhere like Barbados, it has a reputation when people travel to Barbados, there's this idea, the people, they're so friendly, they're so welcoming. And so I thought, well, what's the kind of more sinister way of thinking about that? And well, it's this idea that, what if you're having just a shit day, and you're in a bad mood? And you are maybe a little bit rude or a little snappy, or maybe you don't smile as big as is expected of you. Are you letting your whole country down? Are you potentially one small cog in a machine of industry that could affect the entire kind of economic industry? And maybe I'm overstating it, but I was really interested in that connection between we're a highly tourism dependent economy, and the tourism itself is so highly dependent on the friendliness and the congeniality of the population. And so I just kind of thought, I just wanted to talk about that idea and critique that idea and center the people at the hotel and the wait staff and turn a lens on the tourist and maybe reflect them back to themselves in a way that perhaps isn't entirely flattering. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you sharing it and letting us know that you almost had to fight for those quotes, fight for that theme throughout. And I think we often think of authors of having complete own say in what their story is, and I think it's really meaningful that you brought that messaging in, and speaks a lot to even throughout what should be yours of having to fight for these stories, right? And these stories that we talked about needing to be told. So
yeah, I mean, books, they just publish their small books to sell, so there's often a question of market and readership. And I was also challenged sometimes on comprehensibility of certain references. And I remember at one point, there's a very, very small reference to cricket at one point in the book. One character says to the other character something about him being a Yorker guy, which is a type of bowling. Not a big deal. But I remember my editor flagged it, and she was like, I don't get this. And I was like, but you don't have to, man. It's not for you. It's not for you, right? And so, I felt really bitter. I did not write this book for Canadians. I didn't write this book I wrote this book for Bajans. Bajans first and foremost, those are the people I care about. Caribbean people, very close second. And yeah, I had to lobby for that occasionally. Not to say, I mean, I'm making it sound like it was a big brawl, but it was, you know. But yeah, there's this idea that we need to market ourselves in a way that we're palatable and easily, kind of using whole Caleb's digestion language now, but like, you know, and I reject that idea. I want to read stories about a specific place and specific people that come from somewhere, and I want those stories, and I don't need everything spelled out for me. You know, like if we can believe Middle Earth, we can believe.
I love that, and it's a discussion I actually had with some of my friends lately of just when you look at things like Bridgerton or something, for example, it's like, why do we believe all these fantasies, all these made up stories, but it's the fact that there's people who come.
It's not even historically inaccurate. Like the Essay Infusion book that I referenced in my opening remarks, like that's what she does in those Massey lectures, and she talks about how throughout history there are these, you know, there were black people everywhere in Europe in the 1600s, 1700s, not necessarily slaves or descended from slaves or began as slaves and then became free. And so I actually think sometimes fiction tells more of a truth, right? Like the stories that are invented can sometimes actually be more accurate because the official narrative is very exclusionary and has erased a lot of black people from history. So the idea that, yeah, like, I know, maybe that Bridgerton, Shonda Rhimes' version is maybe something closer to the truth.
I like that. I feel like we need to put that quote on a t-shirt or something. Like, sometimes fiction is telling more of the real story. And I really appreciate what you're saying in your introduction as well about storytelling and the power of storytelling, no matter how that looks. And I think, yeah, this isn't on my notes, but I think it speaks really well what you're saying, and the fact that you have to kind of lobby for that to be in your introduction and lobby for that to be a theme, speaks really well to this idea of own voices and black storytelling and letting people tell the stories that they know and letting them tell them in an authentic way without whitewashing them. So I really appreciate that that's in there. Thank you for that. Moving on to other things that aren't just quotes. Can you tell us a little bit more about the choice of the title, The Island of Forgetting?
Yeah, so speaking of the publishing process, that was very kind of last minute actually of an adjustment. I don't even remember what the original title was. It was a quote from the Odyssey, I think. And yeah, the publishers were just really pushing for something else, and I was just throwing so many options out there. And I don't really remember, it was like the 100th email exchange or something where I came up with this, and they were like, "Hey, we like it." And I was like, "Good God, what have you done with this conversation?" But it was one of those strange things where it ended up just being so apt in hindsight. And I ended up finding, as I was rereading the book in the final edits, all of these references to memory and forgetting. And then I went through and kind of sprinkled a few more in there to like tie it all together. But yeah, I wanted, the story is very much about, like I said earlier, the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and the idea of like an inherited narrative that we get from our parents and from their parents, and this idea of kind of the unknowability of our parents, and then how that then ends up making ourselves, I was fascinated by this idea, can you really know yourself if you don't really know where you come from? And so in the story there's this kind of dark family secret of something that Iapetus witnesses when he's a child, and how that affects him, and then how his son inherits that secret and that trauma, and that's passed on and passed on and passed on, but it's never really spoken about, and it's not really actually known or revealed until the very end. So yeah, The Island of Forgetting is just, about memory. That's really what it's about. But it didn't come to me first. It wasn't the title for a really, really long time. So it was one of those strange things that just kind of worked out, which is the case with writing a lot that happens. Things change in the edits, things change at the last minute, big things that you couldn't predict. Can all feel, so much of it is obviously within your control, like you're the one writing it, But then you just, even the whole idea of the book, like what if I hadn't stumbled across that story about Calypso, or, I hadn't been on a Wikipedia rabbit hole that day. So much of it is serendipitous as well.
Yeah. I like hearing about that. I like hearing how the origin started. I know sometimes it starts with a title or an idea, and I think it's really interesting hearing that it started with Calypso. How do you think expanding it beyond Calypso into the multi-generations allowed you to dive into more themes or more aspects of the story?
I mean, I knew that I wanted to tell an intergenerational story, and then again, the Greek mythology really helped, because I mean, in Greek mythology, often characters, like mythological characters, have these kind of inherited, it's very about destiny and this idea that, your life is kind of planned out for you, and there's a lot of punishment that happens. Like Atlas is punished to hold up the sky for basically taking the wrong side in a war, and so I really liked that idea, again, with the parallels between the Greek mythology and then the idea of kind of intergenerational trauma. And then it just allowed me to write a novel, because I had only ever written short stories up to that point, and so it was a little bit of a hack for me to be like, well, if I have 4 different narrators, I can just write 4 long short stories. And then it gets to be a book. And then I had to figure out afterwards, well, how do I actually thread a narrative all the way through so that it has an arc? But yeah, it was really just, it was just how it kind of came to me. And then, I ended up kind of falling in love with the other characters. Probably not as much as Calypso. Calypso still remains very much the beating heart of the novel for me, but writing Atlas was a joy as well, and that's just how it happened. I don't really know. It's a little bit outside of myself.
That's fair. I feel like some of these questions might be a little unfair to you.
No, that's okay.
It happened that way. I'm like, well, let's analyze it. But I think it's funny that you say that it felt like a little hack for you to do these multiple different narratives, because I feel like they do, once everyone reads the book, or if you have read the book, they do flow together really well, and I think, to me, it really allows so many different perspectives on the same story. And seeing how we relate to our generations, and how some stories aren't known, and I think that, I don't know, we can get into the idea of forgetting and memory as well, which is another theme. But.
For sure. Well, the way the book is structured, it's not like a braided narrative where we get one person's point of view for a few chapters and then we come back to them later. It's really like we get one person for, say 30, 40 pages, and then it ends, and then it's like part 2, and all of a sudden we're 20 years in the future, and we're only now getting first-person point of view of their child. And again, there was a little pushback about this early on in the book, in the editing phases, where it was suggested, well, I don't want to just be done with Atlas and never hear from him again. And I was like, well, that's how life is. So but I really like this idea that because what ends up happening is that the reader kind of ends up knowing more about these characters than they do themselves, because we have the context of having heard from the parent. And so you get this kind of frustration almost sometimes, where you're, the way Calypso, for example, will talk about her mother. She describes her as being just kind of this almost just busy person who only cares about work, and who has this really small world, because that's how she sees her. But we know Calypso is not a reliable narrator, because we know the mother, and we've seen all that she sacrificed to be to that point. So I was really interested in that idea of kind of the dramatic irony for the reader of being able to kind of know these things, but being forced to only hear this story from this one point of view. I really wanted to play around with that, and the only way to do that was to kind of just tell it chronologically all the way through, and kind of just skip to each voice. And it was really fun, and it frustrated a lot of people. I've had people come up to me and be like, I wanted more of this, and I wanted more of that. So that's too damn bad.
I personally really loved it, and I think it makes me think more and honestly wondering what perspectives I have of people without knowing the full story, right? And it's interesting to know the full story as you're going through and to, want to shake Calypso and be like, oh no, you don't know everything.
Yeah.
But then it also makes you think about the way that you perceive people without knowing their full story as well, which I think is really lovely.
I'll share like a little anecdote about that. So my dad, he's passed away now, but I remember when I was about 21 or 22, I graduated from the University of Toronto and I was very lost. I didn't know what I was going to do at the ripe old age of 22. I was like, my life is over, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I just, I didn't know what to do next. I was waiting tables and I just felt very untethered and unmoored. And my father he had, when he died, he was an engineer, he had a PhD. He went straight through his schooling and had a PhD by the time he was, 30. And always to me, I held him kind of in my imagination as this just person who knew what he wanted to do in life and set out and achieved it and was successful. And so I remember calling him from I think I was probably living in Toronto or Montreal at the time, and I would call him late at night one night, and I was just like so anxious and upset, and I was just like, God, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Like I feel so lost, and I feel like, I should have a plan. I should be going to grad school or something. Like I just don't know what to do. And he told me this story about when he was an undergraduate student at McGill in engineering, about how he got so depressed one semester that he almost flunked out, and my grandparents had to fly him back to Barbados, and he had to take a semester off because his roommate at McGill called his parents to basically come and it reoriented my whole understanding of like who he was as a person and everything that he had been through, and it was just mind-boggling. So I think that was kind of in the back of my mind when I was writing the story as well, of this idea of like, we don't know people and what they've been through, even the people closest to us, even the people who formed us. And that's so fascinating because obviously him having undergone that experience informed who he was, which informed his parenting style, which then informs who I am, but I didn't even know that it had happened. So, I don't know, that was what was fascinating for me.
Yeah, I love that, and I think tying that into this theme of forgetting and memory, of almost forgetting, like intergenerationally, things being forgotten but also remembered in your body.
Yes.
Of maybe things not being discussed, so it's not getting passed along, so it's forgotten, but the memory holds on.
I love that idea that it's from that, the body remembers. Yes, it's 100% true. And the idea of kind of tourism is this kind of colonial legacy and intergenerational trauma in the Caribbean. It's like you can't not talk about slavery and the plantation system, even though this is a story that technically begins in 1962. You can trace the origin of that trauma all the way back. And so that was also in my mind as I was writing it as well.
Do you think forgetfulness or the attempt to forget were characters' ways of dealing with the trauma throughout the book?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. I've never really thought of it that way, but that is definitely what they're doing. Each character is trying to just find their way. We meet each character at around age 17, 18, which is really kind of like a pivot point in a lot of people's lives. And each of them are kind of grappling with what to do next and kind of how to be a whole person in the world. And they all have their different ways of dealing with that. And Atlas thinks that he needs to get out. He needs to go, because he grew up essentially kind of like as like the poor cousin in this house with his uncle, and always kind of treated as inferior. He wants to kind of get out of Barbados and go to the UK and make something of himself, but he's also torn between the loyalty that he feels to his family, and he ends up staying, spoiler alert, sorry, but and then figuring out how to still kind of fulfill his dreams and not feel like he's like less of a person because he didn't do what he set out to do. Yeah, and then Calypso, she's looking in all the wrong places. Like, that girl makes some really bad decisions. But yeah, she's seeking power, she's seeking control, she's seeking adventure. And she sees her parents, who are very hardworking and have given her the best life that they could, but she sees them as just kind of laboring along and living this life of drudgery, and she wants to be big, and she wants to be, she wants to be powerful, and she thinks that by having basically these relationships with these like white men, these older white men, that is her way of exercising her power and gaining control. But again, we the readers know, like, girl, no, it's not going to end well for you. But yeah, they are kind of, it does come back to the idea of memory in the end. At the end of the day, you're right. Like, it is about them kind of seeking some sort of control over what they don't know and what they can. Yeah, it's a really good point.
I don't want to put words in your mouth or interpretations of your writing and what the story means and what you're intending throughout the book either. But yeah, I do find it interesting too, as you were saying, this push and pull of some of the characters just wanting to get out, just wanting to find their way out, and then one character that ends up in Canada and all they want to do is find their way back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's really interesting with this idea of forgetting and memory as well. And Odie, one of the characters in the book, at one place says, "This place is making me forget who I am."
Yeah.
And I guess that's coming a little bit more from the tourist point of view, but you feel like that relates to any of the other characters?
I mean, to a certain extent, I think Odie, he says that. So Odie is the Odysseus of the story, and he's come to Barbados as part of a team that's going to be demolishing and redeveloping a hotel, basically building this big resort. But he ends up getting sucked into this relationship with Calypso, and by the end of her section, everything has kind of fallen apart for him. And so that was kind of just a play on this idea of the foreigner coming and kind of losing themselves in the idea of what a place is supposed to be and the fantasy. So yeah, I don't know if the other characters are forgetting who they are. I think it's different. I think Barbados is home to them, and particularly for Nautilus, the character who kind of takes place in like present day, in the final narrator of the book. Yeah, his mother, Calypso, kind of had these dreams of traveling and becoming a singer and living abroad, and his grandfather wanted to study overseas. So I wanted to make sure that I had one character who wasn't striving to leave, because that's just not realistic, first of all. Like, not everybody in Barbados is like itching to get out of Barbados. I'm itching to get back, frankly. So I wanted to kind of make sure that I balanced that out. But also, because Nautilus is queer, there was this idea of, well, he loves his home, but it just doesn't love him back. And I wanted to explore that, like this. That was just really fascinating to me. The person who feels the most, and there's a scene in his section where he's watching the tourists, and he's trying to imagine himself as one of them, and he can't. Like, he is Bajan, like, he feels so rooted and rooted there, but there's this aspect of himself that is just rejected because of the homophobia. So yeah, that was kind of more what that was about, like making sure that I had the balance of not just having this kind of all of the characters wanting to emigrate, but also I really was interested in that tension of somebody who feels so at home in a place but has to compromise this essential part of themselves in order to survive.
Yeah, I really like that part too, and that's you saying, like, wanting to be there, but not, like, or loving a place, but not feeling like it loves you back, I think was a really powerful part of his section of the book. Okay, I am aware that I have a lot of power sitting up here with the microphone, and I'm just asking all of the questions that I want to ask, but I do want to leave a little bit of room for Q&A. So I think the last thing that I'll ask you is just, do you have any new books or projects on the horizon? Are we allowed to know?
Yeah, I'm very, very, very early stages working on another novel. It's also set in Barbados. also historical fiction. Sensing a theme here. I can't really talk too much about it because I genuinely have not written very much of it. Like I said in the beginning, like I didn't have kids when I wrote this book, and it's a whole different world now. I don't know how people do anything when they have kids. Anyone have any tips? Let me know after. But yeah, it's going to be kind of a historical kind of reimagining of what would happen if in 1966, when Barbados was poised to gain its independence from the United Kingdom, something went wrong and it never happened, and kind of what would the fallout of that be. And I'm thinking a lot about how fragile our freedom is because of, apropos of nothing, that's just been on my mind lately. Colonialism and how real it is and how present it is and how much we have to remain just wary of not slipping. That's kind of what I'm thinking a lot about right now. And that's what I'm going to be working on.
Okay, well, I'm keeping an eye out for that for sure. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. I do want to open up the room. If anybody has a question, maybe just raise your hand, and I'm going to get Jamila to come run around. If not, I mean, I can keep holding the space and taking this power, but any questions out there for Jasmine?
I read it.
Thank you very much. My question, I haven't read the book, but just how you were introduced with your family and the 4 generations of the book. And when your introduction was talking about how it's not the same when you wrote it and who you are today, but I see also a very powerful woman who wants what you want, who speaks the truth and makes sure that others hear it. So that intergenerational thing happening to you, the loss of parents, and how you're going to take some of that and be the parent, and how your child is going to make that difference.
Yeah.
So that cycle of life. And then the other thing that you talked about the tourists, and you went up in Victoria with the cruise ships. So,
Inescapable.
yeah. So but all of those things that really struck me in your conversation, but I'm really, as Madison talked about going forward, it's that intergenerational thing that's going to happen because it does affect us all.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. The History Awareness Society, the Black History Awareness Society is trying to find that. We have memories, but when they're triggered by something else, do we actually come to realities of that's the way it was and who we are. I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to reading the book.
Oh, thank you so much for your comment. Thank you.
No, but the question was
Oh.
generations.
I'm sorry.
There was a question in that, how you feel
Oh,
as your 4 generations are in the book. And I just heard about your parents
yeah.
and your daughter. That's 3 generations.
Yeah.
And how that's going forward and what your maybe next venture will be.
Yeah.
The rest was just
Art imitating life, life imitating art, for sure. There's so many things in the book that I hadn't yet experienced when I wrote them, and then that have kind of come true. And I think I get asked quite a lot about how much the book is inspired by my life and my own family members, and there are definitely elements of reality in the book for sure, and certain people that I know that I drew stories. But the way that works, the kind of alchemy of how a story is made, and the parts of it that you draw from your own life, and the parts of it that are pure creation, and then the ways that kind of your own lived experience evolves and then impacts your storytelling. I'm just living that right now, and it's so difficult to kind of analyze it and answer your question because it's so much my present, and because I'm right at this strange stage right now of I wrote a book I did it, I can't remember how I did it, it feels like it was magic, and now I'm kind of being asked to do it again, and I don't know how. It feels like I'm back to the drawing board. So it's a beautiful question, and I'm so interested in exactly what you're saying, but I'm so close to it right now, and I'm so in it that I can't even really step back and analyze it. I'm just trying to figure out how to tell another story, and it just feels like lightning in a bottle a little bit.
Thank you. Enjoy the moment.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm gonna get up. My name is Sylvia, and I haven't read the book, but thank you so much for the time and for the history, the stories that you're telling us, and how you feel, because it seems like you feel very proud of the job that you have done with the book. So as I said, I haven't read the book, so I'm going to ask you a question about the process
Please.
of publishing a book
Sure.
as a black woman with a white editor. So my question is on that premises, that do you think it's very difficult to have an editor that doesn't understand your culture, where you're coming from? How do you present? So when she, for example, tells you, well, why don't you change this name, or why don't you change this aspect of the book? So how do you defend that in a way that is of course is respectful to the other person, but also you are able to save or to guard your essence?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. Like I said in the beginning when I talked about how I want to be inundated with black stories in any form, that also means black publishers and black editors. I had the fortune of my editor, despite those occasional slip-ups, was very open and well-read and well-versed in lots of different types of writing. So she didn't come with a very strong point of view that she tried to impose on me by any means. But any time that there was any sort of pushback, I did really have to advocate for myself. And I am probably the least shy person that you'll ever meet in your life, so that wasn't too difficult for me. But I did think, well, what if I was in a position, what if I wasn't me, and I was somebody who felt like they were just so kind of bowled over by the whole opportunity and intimidated and wouldn't feel comfortable kind of, advocating for themselves in that way. And that was kind of front of mind a lot of times during the process. Fortunately, I felt comfortable doing that, and I felt safe enough in my, and also, I have a lot of privilege. Like, I'm a light-skinned black woman, I'm educated, I've lived in Canada for long enough that I know kind of how things work. So I had that working for me as well, so it's also important to bear that in mind. But yeah, I was thinking about that a lot. And so, we need more black editors, we need black publishers. It's important. It shapes the stories, and then the stories shape the world. So it's all important work. Yeah, thank you for that question. And then I'm messing up the camera shot. Thanks.
Hey, thank you for coming in, and thank you for your time. This book seems like a great read, and I am in awe of the characters that you've drawn. The juxtaposition with Oedipus and Kronos, that was, I think, in the introduction, I believe?
Iapetus and Cronus, yeah.
Iapetus, sorry, my
That's
bad.
okay.
That was really something that moved me as well. When you told me how, when we heard how Iapetus was this meek character, like a mongoose, as said, and Kronos was this larger-than-life kind of guy who took everything that came to him, like the blows that were mentioned, like a hot air balloon, and is big now. And
great memory.
thank you. So what I wanted to ask was, does this have deeper connotations of histories, of their histories, and how histories of world have been? Does it have deeper connotations? Because I believe writers draw characters belonging to their lives as well, like something that they have already known, right? That is what they draw it from, apparently. And I don't know if you did the same, but just wanted to know if there were any deeper connotations to histories that we have experience of the world have seen.
Yeah.
Wanted to know that.
I think not consciously. I wish I could write, like I'd defend this like a dissertation right now and kind of reference all of the things that I was thinking about. What I was thinking about with the relationship between the two brothers, and then in general all of the characters and how much space they take up, I was thinking a lot about the choices that we make and the agency that we have within this kind of limited frame. So all of the characters are making choices, and they're exercising agency, and they're making decisions, but they're limited by circumstance. And so that was something that was really intriguing to me, was how different people respond, even within the same family, even growing up in the same house, how different people respond to different circumstances. And so I could probably write a book for each character, like even the relationship between the cousins who grow up together, Atlas and Z, who's based on Zeus. I was really intrigued by this, when you kind of grow up in a house, how that shapes us in different ways. So it was more about that. It was more about agency and the limits thereof, and the barriers to kind of becoming the whole person that we want to be, and how do we do that? How do we how do we imagine a future for ourselves within the limitations that we're given? But yeah, I wish I could say it was a reference to all this like historical stuff. That would be really cool, but no. Thank you though.
I have a question. So, because you said you wrote the book before you had kids, would you say there was a character you most identified with, and has that changed at all?
Oh, that's such a good question. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, actually. So, not that I necessarily identified with him, but I was very sympathetic to Atlas, who was the father in this story. He's Calypso's dad, and he was just kind of a pleasure to write because he's so fundamentally good and motivated by kind of kindness and loyalty, and I always said he was my favorite character. And then when I had kids, so this, in order to answer this question, I do have to give something away from the book, but in Calypso's section, when she's very, very young, she's raped by this older man. She wouldn't categorize it as such. She was 13, he was like a tourist, a middle-aged tourist, which is something that these kind of very large age gap relationships are quite common in Barbados. Men are very predatory to young girls. But because it's written from her point of view, she never would characterize it as a rape, but it was. And I always kind of wrote to that Atlas kind of knew that this had happened, but had kind of let it slide because he felt this loyalty to not kind of jeopardize the hotel. And now that I have kids, I'm like, well, no, like, I would kill someone, like, they would be dead, so that just wouldn't happen. So it made him less, I kind of thought, how could you let that happen? How could you let that happen to your child, and how could you let him get away with it? And so that, having kids adjusted my whole attitude towards the Atlas character, so that has been kind of front of mind lately, so it's interesting that you asked. But yeah, that's one way for sure. In other ways, it ended up kind of affirming things that I already kind of suspected and that I wrote before I had kids, and I was like, oh, this is true, and then it turned out to be true. Like, I think I was pregnant when I wrote the book, so I was having a lot of anxiety about motherhood kind of preemptively, and that made its way into the book and into the ways that Calypso struggles with being a young mother, and kind of dealing with postpartum depression and things like that, and that ended up all kind of, again, life kind of mirroring fiction in a way. But Yeah, it is really interesting reading the book. I haven't read it all the way through in a long time, but when I do kind of encounter certain passages of people, like astute readers like Madison bring things up, I'm constantly changing my perspective about the book and learning new things about it, which is so strange. It feels very much outside of me now and something kind of apart from me.